So today I'm going to be talking about some work that I did this year and that I'm currently doing, trying to finish off. So it's based on two main bodies of work. One, a book I'm writing, editing on water markets, a global assessment, basically looking at the readiness across the world, across lots of different basins and countries, about where various countries are up to. And two, a report that I did for the AARES with fellow members of the Centre for Global Food and Resources, basically trying to give them information about understanding who participates in water markets, why they do so, what are the drivers, what are the benefits of water markets, and what are also the market failures. So water markets, as I'm sure many of you know, are quite controversial. And I'm going to be looking at some of the arguments for and against them in this presentation. Depending how we go, because I have got a lot of material, I might finish off with a case study of water markets in the New Zealand context, which is part of my water market book, which was done by co-authors in New Zealand. So I'll give some examples of where the state of New Zealand is up to in water markets. Okay,
so it'd be good to have a chance for questions towards the end as well, if you can.
Yes. So if you want to cut me off, I am aiming to try and finish at least 10 minutes early. So, and then the questions, etc. I'm not sure. I mean, I'm also happy to take questions as we go through, but I'm not sure if that will work well or not. But yeah, if there's any issues of clarity needed, please let me know. Okay, so in the context of water scarcity, we know that water is going to become a lot more scarce across the world, especially with climate change patterns, increased variability in rainfall, increased temperatures, etc. So when we're trying to deal with water scarcity, I often like to teach about the 6 Ps. So this is what I try to teach to my students of water security and governance about, you know, how do we deal with water scarcity as a problem that we need to address. So very briefly, there's 2 main strategies. We can try and augmentate supply options, which, you know, we can implement the adoption of new technology, you know, whether it's desalination plants, whether it's building more dams, etc., to increase the amount of water that humans can actually use and the quality of it. Or we can focus on demand management strategies. And so demand management strategies are things such as, you know, education, trying to teach people different water conservation practices. We can regulate, you know, setting restrictions and laws about the use and the patterns of water use. There's 2 particular economic strategies, which I know the economists know quite well: pricing water as a resource, to try and give users an incentive to use it properly and wisely. And number 5 is creating property rights in water markets and allowing water marketisation, so water can be traded from one user to another. And finally, 6, planning is really ties everything together about, you know, how are we going to deal with water scarcity, trying to work out the best way forward. And sometimes the best way forwards is maybe implementing demand management strategies first, with the plan to only implement further supply augmentation strategies when and where they're needed, to avoid issues such as white elephants and unuse. Generally, it's, you know, supply augmentation strategies get a lot more, I'd say, more popular press and are more popular with politicians, for example, to implement, than economic strategies which involve pricing and property rights. But today I'm going to be focusing on water markets and trying to understand them better. Okay, so when we talk about water markets, there's 2 main forms of water markets we can talk about. One is informal water markets. So an informal water market is where water users who are located in a various region or area in the world, they share a water resource. It's not legislated necessarily. It can include, you know, just swapping water between neighbours. It can involve stealing water from rivers or treatable water, etc. And there's no formal governance of how that water is shared. Informal trading is quite significant around the world. It's occurred in many different areas. Informal water trading occurred in Australia, for example, in the 1940s, when there was increased water scarcity there, where farmers just had an agreement between themselves to swap water. So that's one form of markets. A formal water market is quite different, because this is where water use rights are legislated, they are divisible, they're transferable, they're privately managed. It requires a whole heap of rules and processes and catchment areas, etc., that governs the way that water can be used and governs where water can be moved to. Now, when we talk about formal water markets, there's two broad ways of looking at a formal water market. One is through a short-term or a temporary transfer. So this is, I like to describe this is like renting a house. So you rent the use of a license for a particular year, and you use the water allocated within that year. So it's a short-term or temporary transfer. And within the Australian water market, this includes products such as parking, carryover, forwards, options, water leases, etc. On the other hand, another type of formal water market is a permanent transfer of water. So this is a transfer of, it's often called a water license or a water entitlement. And this is like owning a house. So it's owning a right to an ongoing or proportion of available water at a given source. It also includes things such as water delivery rights, which is the right to have water delivered. So you might not have any water, but you have the right, as an irrigation farm, for example, to have water delivered to that farm, and you may source it through the temporary market. So that's the terminology to explain a formal water market. And the picture that you can see on the slide is basically illustrating the zones, the water trading zones within the southern connected basin. So in terms of the water market literature, obviously increasing water scarcity around the world has made the concept of and the topic of water markets a lot more popular. So the graph basically shows that you know, scholarly interest in writing about water markets has increased significantly. When we look at where is the literature concentrated on, most of the literature is focused on the Australian and the US situation. However, you know, there's also been a number of papers written in China, Spain, Chile, Middle East and North Africa, etc. So this is a growing field, and I would suggest that research in this area is only going to increase further in the future. So in terms of trying to understand, you know, how well do water markets actually address the issue of water scarcity? It's often presented as two counter-spectrum arguments for and against water markets. So many opponents take the view that, you know, water is completely different, that water markets cause a huge amount of problems. They can't account for community or environmental or social values. They're often associated with privatisation, corporatisation, deregulation, etc. They exaggerate the biological requirements of water, and they also exaggerate the need for the preservation of agrarian economies. On the other hand, there is some economists who kind of will push the view that water is absolutely no different from other commodities. It puts way too much faith in market systems and unregulated outcomes, and allowing water to be transferred, you know, to the highest value user with a lack of oversight. So that can be the two kind of arguments at either end of the spectrum against, you know, for and against water markets. So in trying to work out, well, who's right here? I mean, both arguments have some elements of being correct, but they're both also incorrect. So for informal and formal water market systems to provide benefits, they have to be governed by a set of conditions, you know, and this requires significant political and financial investment. And some of these conditions, there's basically, I've written about that there's three main conditions you need for successful water markets to actually work and to provide an overall societal benefit. The very, very first one is enabling institutions. So this is institutions, this is having the scientific and the hydrological information and knowledge about, you know, where water is used, the amount of inflows, the sustainable diversion of water use, the positive and negative impacts of moving water around the place, return flow issues, etc. You need strong institutions as well. So you need institutions that basically support the movement and facilitation of water markets. And so, you know, this involves things such as setting caps, understanding and setting shares to each particular area when in a water zone, etc. You need to fully assign responsibility for managing supply. You must have enforcement. You must have monitoring and enforcement and regulation of water use, and to make sure that users are actually following rules, etc. And at the same time, for the institution to be successful, transaction costs. So the implementation of the actual institution and water markets has to be low. So enabling institutions is the number one fundamental thing that can support the development of water markets. And part of the problem when you look right across the world is that many countries do not have sufficient institutional depth and knowledge to be able to successfully manage a transition into a larger scale formal water market. Once you have these institutional foundations in place, to really encourage the development of a water market, and it's important to highlight here that the development of a water market is different from just allowing water trade. So water trade can be allowed between a couple of users, and legislation and law reform can be kept quite simple for this, and it can be beneficial overall, versus the development of a very much larger successful water market. So to develop a larger water market, you need much more consistent trading rules, you need a certain number of users, you need to have benefits and costs from market-based reallocation. So this is where, if you have diversity of agricultural production, it's much more likely to encourage increased trade versus water use all being concentrated in one industry. You need ongoing development of registers and trade rules and information to actually facilitate people's trading. So people have to have an understanding of, you know, information in, for example, information in dams and storages. They have to understand if they transfer water, to what extent, you know, water is subject to various trade rules or tag trade, etc. They have to have information to government policy announcements that actually might change the supply of water and change the market, things such as carryover, water allocations, etc. So these, for a water market to really continue, you have to facilitate the gains from trade and make sure that you have the information and you have the institutionals to continue developing. And this leads into the third main requirement for a successful water market is monitoring and enforcement, is coming back to, again, the institutional kind of foundations needed for water markets. You know, you have to keep reforming your institutions. Once you identify that there's potentially negative impacts happening, you have to keep basically, you know, going through, changing things, and making sure that your transaction costs are kept low, that you might be bringing out new market products. Again, the Murray-Darling Basin water market is a classic example here. You know, in the last few years, it's brought out new water market products such as parking, option contracts and forwards. So a successful water market keeps evolving, and that's what is needed for a water market to keep having net social benefits overall. Okay, so I've kind of been touching on this, but what I'm going to concentrate is on the world's most developed water market, the Australia Murray-Darling Basin. So as we saw in the literature review, the Murray-Darling Basin is one of the most researched water markets in the world, and it's also one of the most oldest ones. So when coming back to my original point about water scarcity, Australia and the Murray-Darling Basin is a classic example of water scarcity and variability issues. So this figure is basically giving an overview of the inflows to the River Murray. So the River Murray is the Murray-Darling Basin's largest river, and this data is from basically 1900 to this year. And what it's showing is that it's highly variable. You know, so some years you have massive floods, but unfortunately, other years you can have significant drought. And what the figure is also showing is that the probability of drought and severe water scarcity is increasing, and especially increasing if you look back in the last 10 years. So this is a concern. This is obviously, you know, this is one of the reasons, this variability and this increase in drought severity, etc., is one of the reasons why there has been attempts and ongoing attempts to reform water policy within the Murray-Darling Basin. The other issue that happens is you can see that most of the wet period of time was basically from after the drought in World War II, basically for about that 50-year period. That's the wettest period on record within the Murray-Darling Basin, and this is at the period of time when most of the water licenses were given out. So this graph is basically highlighting that Australia's irrigated land over the last 100 years, and most of the growth, as I mentioned, is in that period of time when the River Murray was relatively wet. So that is a reason. That's part of the reason why there has been such huge water reform within the Murray-Darling Basin, and this is just a very kind of broad overview of historical water reform, starting with the 1901 Constitution, the cap in the 1990s. The cap was an attempt to say, all right, we're not giving out any more water licenses. We've really got to stop the amount of irrigated land and the amount of water we're using. And at the same time, you know, they moved away from building large storage and infrastructure, etc., to an increasing adoption of demand management strategies such as water markets. The 2004 National Water Initiative was one of the biggest water reforms, and basically really trying to encourage further development of water markets and the unbundling of water from land. You know, this is culminated with the Murray-Darling Basin Plan, which was legislated in 2012-13, with a recognition that the Murray-Darling Basin water use is over-allocated, and that further water had to be returned from a consumptive to an environmental use. So that's kind of past water reform, and there is ongoing water reform. So this is just highlighting just, you know, the continual nature of water reform within the Murray-Darling Basin. And you know, most of the reform nowadays is in regards to state water resource plans, trying to get them revised, the Murray-Darling Basin plan, review of it as to how well it's going, etc., which I'm not going to touch on in this presentation, that because I'm mainly focusing on water markets. So water markets per se, like I said, informal water markets have existed in the Murray-Darling Basin for some time. In terms of more legislated formal water markets, that they started in the 1980s and developed really further in the 1990s, especially because of COAG in 1994 and the National Water Initiative in 2004. So the picture is basically highlighting, you know, pre and post water reform, how, you know, pre-water reform, water rights were bundled with land. Post-reform, water rights are unbundled from land. So what this means is that, you know, you can now, non-land holders can own water without necessarily having to own land with it. So, you know, a water right was unbundled into a water access entitlement and a delivery share, and the water use license is how you can use the water, under what restrictions and what conditions on a parcel of land. So in terms of, you know, where does water allocation trade actually occur in Australia? So basically, within the Murray-Darling, water trade does occur, but right across Australia. But 95% of the number of trades, or the volume, occurs within the Murray-Darling Basin. And within the Murray-Darling Basin, most of those trade volumes is occurring within the southern Murray-Darling Basin, that tends to be a lot more hydrologically connected than the northern Murray-Darling Basin. The same patterns are similar for entitlement trade. And entitlement trade is about a third of the number of trades and volume of trades as water allocation trade. So basically, temporary trading is a lot more adopted, a lot more conducted than permanent trading of water within the Murray-Darling Basin. So just leading on to, well, why is the northern basin so much different to the southern basin? This basically, trying to understand this question provides some really good examples of, you know, well, what drives understanding why irrigators participate in water markets, and an understanding of some of the benefits and costs of trade in water markets as well. So the reason why Southern Basin has, you know, basically 80% of the water market in the whole country, basically you have a lot less hydrological connectivity and public storage in the Northern Basin than the Southern Basin. The Northern Basin has far greater unregulated water entitlements. So this is water entitlements that are basically not monitored, they're not enforced, and they can have implications for both sustainability and water use in various areas. The Northern rely a lot more on groundwater as well as an irrigation source, and they also rely a lot more on flood harvesting and on-farm irrigation storage than Southern irrigators. They pay less money in terms of water usage charges. So in this sense, you know, Southern irrigators have a lot more incentive to do the best that they can and to trade their water when and how they need it. There are far less irrigators in the north than the south. Again, you need a certain body of irrigators and population to be able to have a successful water market occur. And you have far higher irrigated areas per business in the north than the south. You have much more lower monitoring. So the coming back to the institutions that surround water markets, the northern Murray-Darling Basin, which is the top of New South Wales and going into Queensland. When you look at this by region, because all regions are different, so, you know, up to 25 to 51% of extractions in the north are monitored. So basically you can have up to 75% of extractions not monitored in the north, versus the south is much more highly monitored with water meters and checking, etc. Which again is a required condition for a water market to be successful, because you need to know where your water is being used and how it's being used and where it's being moved around. The other main difference between the north and the south is that the north pretty much water use is dominated by cotton, whereas in the south it's very, very diverse across all industries. And these graphs are basically highlighting this fact between the north and the south. This is kind of a spatial overview of water use by industry across the last kind of decade or so. And basically, again, this is highlighting that cotton dominates water extractions in the north, whereas in the south, it's very, very much diverse. The other important thing to kind of note from these graphs, and if I had can everyone see the little arrow moving?
Yes, we can see it.
Oh, cool, good. I'll use this as my pointer. So what these graphs are also highlighting is what really kind of happens in drought years. So if you take the southern one, for example, in drought years, you have pastures. So drought years are here at the top of kind of the bar chart. So in drought years, you often have basically dairy farmers stop watering lucerne for their crops. You have rice also stop planting, etc. And you know, even though they don't have much allocation, they often will sell and trade that water to permanent crops such as grapes, fruit and nut, for example, that need consistency. You know, if they don't give their crops minimum water, then they're going to lose a whole crop, and then, you know, you have a significant investment that you need to before you can actually re-establish all those trees. So you can get water swapping between annual crops to permanent crops in a period of drought. So this is where, and cotton also as an annual crop is also highly variable in that sense. So this is where having, you know, often it's argued in Australia that, oh, we shouldn't, you know, we're a water scarce country, we should not be growing crops such as rice and cotton in Australia, and this is definitely not something I agree with. You need crops that can basically shut down for a year, that can be highly adaptable to be able to sustain other crops who need a certain amount of water to stay alive. So, you know, this is another reason why the southern Murray-Darling Basin has been so successful, because of the diversity of different production that allows it to basically, you know, in times where there is a drought and rice farmers, for example, can't put a crop in and have any income, they can sell their water at very high prices to irrigators who need it, which helps them stay alive and stave off bankruptcy, for example, versus the permanent growers who don't end up losing a crop as a consequence. Okay, just looking at the time, 11:30. So in terms of trying to understand, so that was kind of, you know, an overview of the market. in terms of trying to understand, what drives participation, why do irrigators participate, and what's their profile in water markets, we can look at this two ways. One is micro-level analysis, which is, cross-sectional surveys, finding out from people what trades they do, etc., and trying to look at their characteristics. And one is macro-level analysis, which, involves time series data, CGE analysis, partial equilibrium models, etc. So in micro-level analysis, it's about trying to understand who is participating in water markets. And within the Murray-Darling Basin, especially since water was unbundled from land, you can have a range of stakeholders, and they all participate currently in water markets. We've got irrigators, we've got irrigation infrastructure operators, we've got non-land holders, so this is people such as and bodies such as superannuation companies, water traders, brokers, investors, financial investors. There's environmental water holders, both NGOs, state and Commonwealth. Urban water companies can buy up water entitlements, so they can shore up urban water use. Mining companies and First Nation stakeholders. So if we're trying to model from a micro level perspective what drives water market participation, we can model this in so many different ways, and choices aren't binary as well, and this is what makes kind of modelling water markets very difficult. So first of all, whether you participate in a water market, it could be as an individual participation. So this is where, if water has been unbundled from land, an individual irrigator, for example, can choose, I'm going to enter the water market at a particular point in time, versus a collective participation. This is where, the irrigation infrastructure operator or the district who owns the rights, they participate as a collective of irrigators within a water market. And it depends where you are around the world. For example, the US, to date, it's been a lot of collective participation in water markets. So as an irrigator, if I'm going to participate in a water market, I've got a choice between temporary and permanent, where I'm going to actually participate. And I've got a choice, am I going to buy, I'm going to sell. And not only that, I have to make a decision about how much water am I going to buy or sell, and when am I going to buy or sell. Am I risk averse? Am I going to come in at the beginning of a season? Given that water seasons, they go through, they are a financial year in terms of trying to understand, if I don't know what my full water allocation and it's going to be a drought, do I come in early and buy a whole heap of water because I'm afraid the market is just going to increase significantly? Or do I just buy a little bit and I buy every couple of months only what I need? So if we're trying to model water market choices, it can be very difficult. And like I said, they're not binary. I can come in, if I'm risk averse, I need some water, I can come in at the beginning of the season, buy water, and then at the end of the season, because I was risk averse and I got more water than expected, I go back to sell water. So these are all the issues that kind of, when you're trying to model water markets, you're modelling it as a trader, you're modelling it as a buyer or sell, in what market. These are things that all need to be considered. Having said that, this graph is basically highlighting how common water market participation has increased over time. And the blue line is water allocation trade, temporary trade, and the red line is permanent trade. So it's basically indicating that, trade has been temporary trade has been much more adopted than permanent trade. And one of the reasons is because it's only a temporary trade, it's not a long-term decision. In terms of understanding water market adoption, given it's kind of a skill, it's not a technology, although you can use a variety of different technologies to actually advise your trade strategies. It's kind of a soft skill. So the question is, well, is it similar to other adoptions that we know of? And so if we compare that graph to, the famous hybrid corn diffusion example of trying to understand adoption, it is kind of similar. So, water market participation is following a very similar pattern to other kind of adoptions, but you know, it's not 100% the same. When we're thinking about water market participation, you know, it can vary right across years. You have more participation in dry years. So, you know, if farmers in dry years when water is scarce, there is much more higher likelihood of farmers going onto a market, especially the allocation market, to buy water. These graphs, so the graph on the left is basically highlighting water trade prices and volumes in the Goulburn over time from the early 90s to 2020. So what this is highlighting, if you look at the red line, water allocation prices are highly variable and have, you know, they can go from $10 a megalitre up to $1,000 a megalitre in a period of drought, which is what they hit in the Millennium Drought. And then when it rains, they can fall back down to $10 a megalitre. So depending on scarcity factors, it can very much influence that. On the other hand, water entitlement prices are basically bouncing up very slowly, quite rapidly, I'd say, in the last 5 years. And even though they are variable as well, they're not as variable as water allocation prices. So again, you know, in terms of knowing what we know about water markets and whether adopters fit the same profile, you know, whether they fit the early adopter profile as compared to other kind of, you know, classic studies on technology adoption, there is evidence that early adopters were more sophisticated, they were higher educated, they were larger, they were more intensive, they seem to have more planning on their farms, and there was also evidence found of market efficiency, that water moved from lower to higher value. If you look at, now that we're in a later stage of water market adoption in the Southern Murray-Darling Basin, if you still look for information or evidence on adoption and market efficiency, you find some, but it's not as strong. Basically, what seems to come out now of all the studies that have looked at recent adoption of water markets, factors such as succession, risk preferences and water scarcity are really the main drivers now. So, you know, farmers themselves are becoming, because it's such a highly adopted form of adaptation in Australia, there's not that much difference between farmers who trade or not trade anymore, but factors such as, you know, is water scarcity, etc., is driving whether farmers are participating in water markets. This typology is just trying to understand that all the different groups of irrigators when it comes to their trade strategy. And what it's showing is that it can be kind of, if you do factor analysis, it can be broken up into 5 areas. So cluster 1 is your expanders, which is kind of your second largest group. So these are people who tend to be younger, in water stress. They're purchasing water allocations, they're expanding, they're changing the irrigated production, etc. Then you have a group that is expanding and diversifying, and they're purchasing the long-term right to water, and they're mainly they're also driven by water stress to some extent. Downsizers, these are the irrigators who are selling water, both temporary and permanent, and selling farmland, obviously with a longer term strategy of leaving the farm or handing it down to successors in the future. And cluster 4 is transitioners. So transitioners are really on a way probably to being downsizers, but they're reducing their risk. They're decreasing their irrigated area, increasing area of dryland production. And finally, kind of the other clusters are the participants who haven't traded much, and they're pretty much, their trade dominant strategy is they're saving water, they're carrying it over. I'm going to skip this regression analysis because we're running a bit out of time. So just as an overview, temporary trade studies are really focusing on short-term considerations in regards the seasonal fluctuations, etc. And permanent water trading is driven by more long-term structural change, reducing debt, expanding future production, planning to exit, or reducing long-term risk exposure. In terms of non-landholder participants and their impact on the market, so remember, these are superannuation companies, they're the financial investors, the environmental water holders. We actually really don't know much about this, and this is one of the main reasons the ACCC conducted an inquiry on it, to try and work out the extent that they have an impact. We know that their share of ownership is increasing to about, and it's currently just over 10%. And we know that they're doing so because they get because of the long-term rise in water values and prices and diversification purposes. As a percentage of trade activity, they have a much larger share of trade activity than actually ownership. And these are some of the reasons why people are concerned about the involvement of non-landholders and the potential influence they're having on the market. There's still not enough known about the impact. My view is it should be quantitatively modelled, which is very hard to do so without having the proper data on this, because their extent is going to be dependent on the liquidity of the market, the volume of their trade, and any other kind of imperfect competition and information asymmetry issues. This graph, and very briefly, this kind of highlights what we were saying before, that generally irrigators tend to not trade that much, but the more sophisticated a participant is, so the more corporate it is, the more that they're a financial investor or investor in general, the more that they use the water market and the more they have a diversity of ownership. So again, this is kind of reflecting issues of concern within of non-landholders in water markets. In terms of environment water holders, they are the largest water market owner in the Murray-Darling Basin at the moment. And when you combine Commonwealth with other state and NGO owners, they own significant portions, up to 30% in some areas across areas within the Murray-Darling Basin. But they don't trade that much. They transfer water a lot. They have offered temporary sows on the market, and they have started actually maybe thinking of buying some temporary water, which a lot of commentators recommend as a good way for environmental water holders to try and get enough water for some seasonal environmental watering. In terms of First Nations involvement in owning water, it's practically minimal. It's a really shocking statistic, really. The estimate is around 0.04% of water ownership. Far less than the percentage of First Nations within the Murray-Darling Basin population. There's been millions, for example, even set aside in 2018 to buy cultural water rights, and to date there seems to be nothing purchased. So this is a concern for many. In terms of macro level analysis of water markets, you've got influences on both your supply of water on a market, which is very much seasonal, and also driven a little bit by government policy. And you've got influence on demand, the demand factors about why why irrigators need water on the market. We've done work on the drivers of water markets using a whole heap of financial analysis that's generally used for commodity price movements, etc. And what we know from that is that there's the temporary market leads the permanent market. If shocks occur, the shock first occurs in prices and then it goes to volume, so it's a unidirectional spillover. We know that temporary water prices are mainly water scarcity related, and that permanent prices are most influenced more by the previous permanent water price and current temporary water market prices. We also know that government recovery has not seemed to have impacted on prices. It has impacted on volumes. It has actually increased volatility, and that temporary water markets are a whole lot more volatile than permanent markets. But there is still lots of questions that remain in terms of trying to understand impacts of government policy on lots of different entitlements. We've only done this work for the largest market high security entitlement in the Goulburn, because we have the time series going back to the 1990s. This graph is basically highlighting again that, you know, you set up water markets, you have to fully understand all the ramifications of it. So, you know, there is substitutability that occurs, and this graph is showing the Goulburn in Victoria. There is definitely substitutability between resources that occurs between surface water use and groundwater use. And again, if you're not monitoring your groundwater and you have no knowledge of full water use, this is where water markets can actually set up problems. So there is an issue that here the graph is basically highlighting that the closer groundwater bores are to surface water sources, the much higher the pumping that they're actually extracting over time. So this is a concern if it's not being monitored properly. Okay, so in terms of benefits of water markets, we have, there's three, from the economic point of view, there's three main benefits: allocative, dynamic and productive efficiency. So allocative efficiency is really about short-term decision making, how much it's influenced by how we can improve seasonal management and seasonal short-term trading for water allocation trade. And there's lots and lots of studies that show that allocative efficiency is improved with short-term water markets. The second one, dynamic. This is where really permanent water markets allows or improves structural long-term decision making. You know, farmers can invest in new things. They can choose to retire, choose succession, etc. So there's lots of evidence that water markets has allowed long-term shifts in decision making for farms. The third one is productive efficiency, increasing the value of water use, where water can be traded to the highest value use, which is not just agriculture. You know, for example, in the Murray-Darling Basin, this can include urban, environmental and culture. This is basically highlighting that, you know, there's been loads of economic studies that have tried to look at, well, what are the benefits of water markets? And, you know, they've all come up with estimates in the millions to billions. So, you know, for water markets to be successful, like we've said in the beginning, they need strong institutional, scientific governance. And, you know, if there is an issue with it, what we have to try and assess is where there's evidence of market failure. And the second issue is distributional impacts of water markets. So there is currently significant evidence that there's water market failure occurring in Murray-Darling Basin. So there's evidence of imperfect competition, issues with intervalley trade, Northern Basin unregulation issues, tagging, unregulated water broker behaviour, etc. There's also clearly evidence of lots of negative externalities happening. And, you know, again, this is often because of unclear property rights, lack of enforcement and monitoring, and both positive and negative environmental externalities from the movement of water use across the area. There's also information asymmetry, in particular adverse selection in water markets. This is in regards to, you know, how data and information on prices and volumes is often presented in registers, information on weather and carryover, issues in regards to insider trading, membership of groups, unregulated water broker behaviour, etc. So there's ACCC, the current inquiry report has made numerous recommendations about how we can improve water markets within the Murray-Darling Basin. What people often worry about when they talk about water markets is distributional impacts. that, for example, some farmers end up having to pay a lot more money for temporary water than they have in the past. Now, as economists, we know that, you know, changes in water prices represent pecuniary externalities, and, you know, they influence different stakeholders differently, but they trade off. $1 for a buyer is traded off for against $1 a seller. So in complete markets, it is not an issue, but in incomplete markets, it is an issue. And there are issues of incomplete markets within Australia's Murray-Darling Basin. So, you know, this is in regards to resource constraints, the information asymmetry, gifted infrastructure asset issues, distribution of initial property rights. This is where First People nations issues come into account, because they weren't distributed any rights to water, even though they should be. So there are, in sum, there are distributional issues that we need to consider. Looking at the time, I don't have the time to kind of talk about the New Zealand case study for Canterbury and compare it to Australia, but I am happy. Oh, I will send anyone the book once I finish it. And I will just conclude briefly. So water markets are not perfect, but they have played a very significant role in helping distribute water in times of scarcity, and they've had a range of benefits associated with them. But it doesn't mean that they don't need reform, and there is lots of areas that they need reform in. And, you know, and going forward, what it also highlights is that many countries around the world do not have the capacity or the institutional, scientific, regulatory capacity to implement formal water markets. So thank you, and I'm sorry I've gone a little bit over time.